And this is part 5. So for part 5, we're going to be putting together the power supply and the heat bed. So let's get our parts ready. This is the heat bed. Let's get it out of the package and see what we have. And these are the wiring for the power supply and the heat bed. We'll take out the ones in the manual and we'll separate them. We can see they have different ends on them, so we'll pick the 2 ends with the eyelets on them. Those are the ones we're going to use, and the rest of them we'll put away for now. Let's get some hardware out. So we need a couple bolts, a couple of washers, and a couple of nuts to go on the bolts. And we're going to use that hardware to attach the 2 wire eyelets to the heat bed. Up in the corner there's some copper pads, and we'll get those attached. So let's get our hardware together so that we can easily put it through the bed and the eyelets and get it attached. So when we're attaching this, we want to make sure that the eyelets have good contact with the copper pads on the heat bed, because they're going to be passing a lot of current. If the contact isn't good, it will produce heat at this joint, so make sure that the bolts are tight and firm and there's good contact there. So doing this is a little bit awkward because the heat bed has some magnets in it, and that just makes it a little bit odd to try and get a grip of the head of the bolt and tighten it down, because the magnets kind of attract the pliers as you're going in to grab the head of the bolt or the nut, whichever side you're attaching. So just be careful of that, as you don't want to scratch your heat bed when you're trying to tighten these down. The magnets kind of suck the pliers in. So in the assembly guide, the last step here is to kind of tow these wires inwards towards each other so that the cover for the wires fits properly. So I had already tightened them. I'm going to loosen them up a little bit just so that we can pinch them towards each other so that they're like they are in the assembly guide, and tighten them back up. So let's gather the hardware we need for the next step. Wiring sheath, the plastic covers, and a couple of bolts and nuts. So we'll fit the nuts into the bottom plastic piece, and we will place our top plastic piece over the wiring, and we'll get those clamped together with the bolts and nuts. So from this side of the heat bed, you can see all these silver magnets lining the edge there that I was talking about, that attract the pliers when you're trying to tighten things down. So we got one center screw there on the larger plastic piece. Make sure your wires are kind of guided through the top of that plastic piece before tightening. We don't want to pinch anything. So you'll see here that the magnet kind of attracts the pliers. It holds them on pretty good once they're in place. And then we just tighten up that screw to hold the top plastic piece on. And there goes my Allen key. So we'll grab another one. We'll finish tightening this side up. And then we'll use the plastic wrap or the cable cover to wind around these cables to keep them organized properly and out of the way. So once the wiring sheath is on, we want to kind of tuck it inside the plastic piece so that it gets clamped with the bottom plastic piece so it doesn't get pulled out and expose those wires inside of it. So we'll tighten those two pieces together, which should clamp with just enough force to keep the wiring sheath on there and not move it. And then we'll finish with the wires and getting the entire set covered up by the wiring sheath. And now that's complete, we're going to collect the hardware for attaching the bed to the y-axis. So there's going to be some standoffs to raise the bed up a little bit, and the screws, obviously, to screw it down to the y-axis. So we'll adjust our y-axis out front of the printer so that we have good access to it. We'll drop it on top. And then the instruction manual or the assembly guide tells us to use the pliers to hold these risers in place so that we can drop a screw through or an Allen key to get it lined up properly. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pop an Allen key through the hole here and look underneath and guide the Allen key through that center mount so that it lines up, and then we can take the Allen key out and drop a screw in there. And once that screw is finger tight, we'll go around the heat bed and do the rest of the mount points and tighten each bolt down. So the assembly guide does point out that it's important that we go with a certain order of tightening down each bolt. So please pay attention to that. And once we've gotten all the bolts down, we can go and finish tightening them up. And that's what I'm going to do here. So you'll see that I follow the pattern that the guide instructed me to by doing the center, then the sides, and then the corners. So now that the bed is all tightened down, let's start with the power supply. We'll collect the hardware for that and the cables that we need. We have two cables left with the blue ends with the finger attachments. We'll use those, and we'll get the power supply attached to the 3D printer. So hopefully in the early stages of assembly, you remember to put the sliding attachment points into the extruded piece of aluminum, because this is where the bolts for the power supply are going to be attached. And them sliding back and forth is, I don't know how important it is, but it makes it easy to get the power supply onto that aluminum extruded rail. So once you have both bolts in the slots on the power supply, it kind of does just hang out there. You don't really need to tighten it too much for it to just sit there. And then you can tighten it up and slide it up against the frame of the 3D printer. and there's some holes there to tighten it down onto the frame. And then here, what we're going to do is start wiring the power supply. So make sure you get the right wires and you put them in the correct spots. They are separated by one attachment point, so you don't want them right next to each other. Pay attention to your wiring guide in the installation manual or the assembly manual. It is important that you get this correct. And I just keep dropping tools. But they should be tightened down and attached firmly. And now we'll attach the black and white wire to the power supply. And it's time to eat gummy bears. Excellent. So after some gummy bears, we are going to install and assemble the main board, or the control board. It's called an ANC, and this is what controls the motors and which direction they need to turn and where the print head needs to go and the extruder and how much it extrudes and all that kind of stuff. So a cool little control board, little computer, pretty complex in how it controls and guides all these motors. So you'll see here what we're attaching to the frame is actually hinges for the door. We're going to be putting the door of the control unit container on before the actual container. So here's the door. We're just going to rest it on the bottom hinge and then attach the top hinge to the door and then screw it to the frame. It doesn't come on and off with any clips or anything like that, so it's pretty firmly on there. So once the door is attached, we're going to put the wire sheath onto the motor here, and we will find out that our motor is mounted 90 degrees off. The wire should be facing directly down, and they're not. Right here I'm going to check if they will interfere at all with the printing. It doesn't seem that they will, so I'm going to leave the motor the way it is and not spend time repositioning the motor. It turns out I was correct. This has really no effect on the capability of the printers at all. I haven't had any issues with it, so it's perfectly fine the way it is. Just don't make the same mistake I did. So I found it a little difficult to get the zip tie tight enough that it held the sheath on those wires really well. I got it as tight as I could, and that was about it. So let's get out our control board and all the hardware to get it attached into the case and the case attached to the frame. So we'll get all our hardware here organized. We'll take a look at the assembly instructions, and we'll see that it has a portion on the back of the case to cut out a additional little window. That's if you get a Raspberry Pi Zero, which I couldn't get because they've been sold out for a long time, and I don't think I'll have a chance to get one, but that's what that little window's for. So I found with this 3D printed part, I had trouble getting the square nuts properly into each slot. It's a little bit finicky. You'll see that some of the slots had some 3D printed stringing inside that I had to clear out with a small Allen key. And I really had to force these square nuts in there with some pliers and stuff like that. So if you're having trouble, just try and look inside each slot and make sure that it's free of any 3D printed debris or stringing or anything like that. You'll see I used the pliers here to really kind of force this in. It did go in eventually, and it went in nice and firmly, and it was lined up properly, so that's what I'll have to say about that. So now that all the hardware is inserted into the 3D printed container for the INSEE, we will put the INSEE control board into its case and get it lined up and attached inside. So it's pretty easy to get lined up inside. Obviously the connection port goes with the connection hole on the case, and we will use the bolts to hold it down inside the case. I found that some of the spots where you gotta put a bolt, it's pretty tight, so I use the pliers there to hold the bolt and get it inside because my fingers are too fat to get in there. And then the last two bolts we screw onto the frame of the 3D printer, and those will hold the INSEE case to the frame. And before we get the case on there, we'll plug in the wire from the motor and make sure it gets routed properly out the side. There's a small cutout on the side of the case there that it goes out of, so it doesn't get pinched when we attach it to the frame. And when you're pushing the case on there, there should be two satisfying clicks that hold it in place. And then there'll be a couple ports on the back of the case for the control board that you can fit your Allen key through and get it attached. The other screw is underneath. It should be pretty easy to get access to. The top one is a little more difficult. You kind of got to aim it through a little hole in the back of the case and into the screw. And once that's tight, that's going to be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!